Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another installment of eBusiness Strategy for 2021. As per usual, can you please put a thumbs up in chat if you can, in fact, hear me? If you can't hear me, I'm hoping you're already typing out a message to let me know that there's no audio. This is especially important tonight because I've just moved and today is the first time I've actually set up everything correctly, so we need to this is a trial by fire to see if the new setup is actually working correctly. Okay, so if you can hear me, please do put a thumbs up in chat. Great, I've got a thumbs up, which means that I'm going to continue with tonight's lecture. Okay, so before we move into the actual content of tonight's lecture, are there any questions about either last week's lecture or any of the research assignments? I see that there has been one question posted in the Discord server. If you do have any questions you'd like me to sort of discuss with you, please do in fact type out your message and I'll then discuss it now while we go through the content of the lecture. So feel free to stop me at any point and ask any questions that you might have about the content or about the research assignments, and let's get started. So tonight we're going to be talking about web pages as the means of reaching the customer. So we already discussed a lot of stuff about the structure of the internet, how it all works, how it all connects, what HTML is. And I do note that there is a question now which says, do we need a table of contents? So technically speaking, for the research assignment, you don't need a table of contents. You don't need a cover page. You don't need a table of contents. You don't need to have an abstract. It is going to all be a content-rich document that you're creating. So you only really need a title that kind of introduces me to the concept, so use something along the lines of the e-business of XYZ Corporation or something like that. So make up an interesting title. It doesn't really matter what the title is, provided that the content falls in line with 50% of the document, you tell me about the organization, 50% of the document, you tell me about what their e-business, what the e-business strategy of that organization is. So what kind of model do they fall into? Is it business to business? Is it business to consumer? Is it business to government? And then tell me generally what is involved in that model. What kind of mechanisms do they need? What kind of services do they need to provide? And then discuss those. So you need to go and do some research. What does business to consumer require? Well, it will require very often some form of a web page and some kind of back-end payment processing systems and things like that. So you don't need a table of contents. You don't need a cover page. And remember, I don't count a cover page or a table of contents or the references towards your page count. So please bear that in mind and don't count those in your page count and then you'll get marks deducted from that. Okay, so if you're happy with that answer, if you're not happy with that answer, let me know. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about web pages. So web pages are where we're in essence going to be interacting with the customer. So we're going to talk about what a web page is and how they are developed, as well as some basic web design principles. We're going to talk a little bit about Web 3.0 integration, and then some ethical versus legal considerations for the design of web pages. So no, this does not supplement your ethical and legal aspects of IT module that you have to take. This is just going to be some things to consider within the context of e-business and e-commerce. So there's another question. Do we follow the LNCS template? So you will note that there is no stipulation about template. So if you go to the bottom of any of the documents for your mini research assignment or the main research assignment, it actually just gives you a list of instructions that you need to have 1.5 line spacing, you need to have narrow margins, you need to have 12 size font, and as long as you follow those, you should be fine. So what I suggest you do is just open up a Word document and go and fill everything in. If you want to make your life really hard, or rather difficult, use an LNCS template because that's going to reduce the size of your text, reduce the size of your spacing, you got double column. So rather not do that. Instead, just stick to having a normal document. Set your line spacing for your paragraph, set your font size accordingly, choose a good size font, and go with it. Remember, I'm not here to test your ability to use a template. I'm here to test your ability to go and research the topic at hand. So you'll find a lot of your other lecturers will specify a particular template to use. I don't see the purpose in that for something like this business kind of research that you're doing. If you want to do a lecture notes in computer science, well, then as long as you change the template to fit with the font sizing and spacing and those kind of things, then I don't really care. So just remember, I'm favoring the value of your content over the use of a template. So remember, try and give me interesting information. Try and write it well. Try and make sure it's a coherent argument that you provide. That for me, as well as good sources and references, is far more important than the use of a template which is aimed at cramming as much information. So question, we submit to Eve, right? Yes, I will be opening up a practical on Eve, which you can then submit to. I normally open it up a week before, just in case you get done with it ahead of time and you want to submit. I only then pull all of the documents after the deadline and then mark all of them. So make sure that you do submit. Is it possible to check for plagiarism? As far as I'm aware, if you log into Ulink, you should have access to Turnitin functionality through there. If not, what I suggest you do is when you get your plagiarism lecture with Professor Lung, ask her about it and see if she is able to then direct you to where you can submit your documents through Turnitin to check for plagiarism. Okay. If I do get any other information about it, I will post it on Eve and on the Discord server. If I don't get any more information, I suggest directing your questions to Prof. Lung, who's in charge of the ethical and legal aspects of it, where there is a plagiarism paper that you have to do. Okay, so if you do have any questions, drop them in the chat and we'll get to them as we go. So tonight we're talking about web pages. So if you remember last week we talked about the structure of the internet, there being a 3-tier architecture, that we have the web client, which is going to be the computer, the tablet, the cell phone that someone who is hopefully going to be our client is going to be sitting on. They're going to have some kind of a web browser, which is then going to request some kind of web page from some kind of a web server. That web server is then got some kind of backend that is going to be responsible for doing things like having a catalog and doing order fulfillment. So statement here, we did get that, so we should just use the same one for plagiarism assignment. Yes, so there isn't a dedicated plagiarism Turnitin location for eBusiness Strategy. So as far as I'm aware, you should be able to use the one that you use for your plagiarism assignment for all of your modules. That's the way I have been led to believe that it works. If you have any information to the contrary, please post in the Discord server. If I find any information to the contrary, I will also post it in the Discord server. Okay, so back to what we were talking about, is that we have this whole web architecture in place, that this web client wants a web page because they want to do some kind of order processing, they want to see some information about the organization, something along those lines. So the internet is going to be this thing called a channel, which is going to be used to deliver information from a web server somewhere on the internet to our web client. So effectively, the client sits at their computer and the server delivers the information in the form of a web page over TCP/IP. So the web page will be formatted as some kind of a text document, HTML, something like that, that's going to be delivered over HTTP. And is going to be routed using TCP/IP. So at the end of the day, we want to see the web page, but the web page doesn't materialize out of nothing. Instead, it gets delivered over the internet with this crudely drawn courier vehicle from a web server somewhere. So if you think about the internet like that, the internet is one big delivery mechanism that we're going to be using to deliver mostly information. So in essence, we need to really like focus in on what exactly are these web pages going to be and what is their role within e-commerce and e-business, because we know that the client gets them, they get delivered from a web server, but what exactly is the nature of the web page? So web pages in essence are important for a number of different reasons. In most cases, small organizations will use them for exposure, which means it provides information or advertising, or in essence, just greater abundance of information than you could deliver over, say, emails or deliver over phone. It is also something that is passive, whereas if you phone people to telemarket to them, that is active. You have to physically go and do that. If you want to email people information, that is active. You have to physically go and email them the information that you need to send them. Whereas when it comes to a web page, you deploy the information once, then people who are looking for that kind of information should hopefully, via the use of a search engine, be able to get the information from your web page. So you no longer have to do the active marketing. People should be able to come to your web page via things like search engines. One step above this is where you actually use the web page for a storefront, where you do commercial or e-commerce activities. So generally, if you're just using a web page for exposure, it generally provides people with the information to then make email orders or phone-in orders or stuff like they did back when the dinosaurs were in existence. But for most of us who live and work and breathe today, we're going to be using the internet as more of a storefront. You go to Amazon, you search for the thing that you want, you place an order, it comes off your credit card, the item gets delivered to your house in a couple of days, months, weeks, depending on what shipping mode you took. If you did a direct courier, it should be here in a week from the US. If you shipped it via South African Post or just general post that lands at SAPO, then you're probably never going to get it, or you'll get it eventually once it's out of warranty or whatever. So the idea is that you can use this web page as a storefront for all of your commercial or e-commerce activities. And this enables you to actually directly sell to people. So instead of you having to sell via something like email or sell via something like telephone, where you would still need to have like an order book to manually manage everything, a lot of the direct selling on the internet is all done autonomously, where you have automatic orders created. You get an email when someone makes an order that tells you what they bought, how much stock you have left, and notifies you of all sorts of information. So what this in essence enables you to do is streamline the way in which you can do e-commerce activities on the internet. One last thing that is often very much overlooked is that you can use a website for customer relations. And what is meant by this is it can help you provide people who utilize your services with information required to maybe fix problems that they have, provide them with information so that they can possibly fix the problems that they might be having. So things like submitting support tickets, to frequently ask questions pages or facts, which can be used to help reduce the burden on your support team, where you instead have it that you've got a web page that tries to troubleshoot people's problems through identifying commonly occurring issues with certain products or processes. But remember, think of this web page as a place that hosts content. The content can be information, the content can be an ability to interact with customers. It could also be the ability to have an entire storefront that you could then sell items on. But remember, you have now got this web page that is going to be used to interact with some kind of a customer. The customer is very often going to be some kind of a human. We're not going to really talk about like having automated processes like bots that are used to snipe things and automate process buying. We're not going to look into anything like that. But for now, just consider that the web page is designed with the human in mind. And that's why we need to literally design web pages that are useful and also easily accessible. Now, if I were to give you two pieces of information that pertain to the same object, like let's say we've got a printer, we want to buy a printer, and the website number 1 has no picture of the printer, but has a very elaborate block of text that describes the printer in wonderful detail. Every little piece of information you could ever want to know about that printer is in that block. And then there's web page number 2, which does not have a giant block of text. Instead has a picture and 3 bullet points that just tell you it does this, this, and this. Which do you think would be better accepted by the person using the internet? Probably the latter, because it requires less information to digest. You look at the picture, it looks like a printer, you're happy. You read the three bullet points of text and you see what it does. You're like, okay, that pretty much aligns with what I want to do. And I didn't have to read that giant block of text. So it comes down to that when you design a web page, you must try and avoid certain things which really put off the person from using it. If you at any point put a hurdle in front of your customer, it becomes very difficult to retain them, because they might think, well, on Amazon I didn't have this problem. I could just go and see bullet points of information and see other people's reviews, and I'd be happy with that. So that is why you mustn't have difficult to understand text. You must have it that your web pages don't crash and break. You must have it that you don't have a confusing navigation system. There's nothing worse than when you get to a web page and it's like, this web page is completely confusing, I don't understand how to use it, and then takes effort for your customer to then interact with the web page. Also, you need to make it as fast as possible. A lot of people use mobile data, especially throughout Africa. Mobile data trumps fixed, installed, wired connections all the time. So people are on data. You don't want to be burning people's data and they go, oh, well, that is a nice website, but it took half my data when I was on there. Then they won't want to come back to your website. Another thing is websites should be now portable, and what this means is they should be able to adapt to scale and resolution as well as different device types. So web pages should actually physically be able to adapt to being on a desktop versus being on a mobile device, because people don't want to go to a Mobi site every time they're on their web page. They come to your web page because they think, well, this doesn't look like the site I'm used to on the desktop, which could then put them off and make them not want to use it or question the credibility of your website. So generally speaking, when we talk about web pages, they need to be loaded up by a browser. So the browser could be on a desktop computer, it could be on a laptop, a tablet, a phone, a watch nowadays. Those things are coming, I'm assuming. And they're normally going to be some kind of text that are going to then be interpreted by your web browser and displayed or rendered to the user. So what we need to ultimately do with these web pages is ensure that they align with the goals of our organization. We don't want web pages that are useless. We don't want web pages that provide outdated information. We don't want web pages that make it more difficult for us to do business. We want them to enable us to do business in a more streamlined way. So we don't just want an e-commerce site that enables us to do commerce. We want an e-business site that allows us to do e-commerce but more efficiently. So keep that in mind as we move forward. That think about it. A web page should do what it says, or it should be built to some kind of a purpose. But at the end of the day, it needs to be efficient and lend well to the goals of the organization. So when we design web pages, we're typically going to be looking at a process. And the process is normally going to be, we need to actually write the web page. Now, a lot of the time, you've got frameworks that will generate all of the underlying page files for you, and you just create the high-level structures, define them, and then it'll automatically lay them out and do all that kind of stuff for you. But in the very most basic sense, you're going to be preparing the web page. It needs to be loaded into a browser to see that it actually is then previewable in some way, so that you can then check to see that it is correct, reformat as necessary, and then publish it onto the web. So it's not as straightforward as just write the web page, deploy it. There should always be the cycle involved, and it's very often referred to as a system development life cycle, where you're going to create a web page, but you don't know what web page you want just yet. So you have to then design the web page. But how do you know what you're designing? Well, you need to figure out what your needs are. So you do a process of information gathering, which is going to be considered your requirement solicitation and things like that, where you need to figure out what the purpose of the website is, what goals your organization has in using this website, who the target audience is, and what kind of content you want to put onto the website. Once you know all of that foundational information, you can begin planning. And the planning phase is where you're going to be designing what the web page is going to be looking like. You're going to be designing what kind of elements you want to have on it, what kind of technologies you're going to use to actually achieve those kind of goals, and then figure out where you're going to put the web page. Because remember, you can't just throw the web page onto the internet. It needs to be on tier 2. It needs to have a web server to connect to. And remember last week we talked about, do you want to host your own web server, or do you want to go with the cloud option? So these are the kind of decisions you need to make during the planning phase. And some of those factors we talked about last week, but other things would be things like price, how secure is our data going to be, can things be flexible and scalable for our needs so that if our organization explodes in popularity, we're not going to be left behind waiting for servers to be delivered. We could just have maybe a pricing change with our plan, and then we get better services. Things like connectivity, performance, support, and maybe adding new functionality as the website grows and evolves over time. Things like reputation can also be important, but also something like geographical location. I know we talk about having the internet as this thing that connects the entirety of the globe, but geographical location is important for things like load times and ping, and depending on what kind of things you're trying to do with your website, those kind of things might factor in. But also things like data privacy laws and tax implications based on where you host your website. So these are all things that your organization is going to need to look into before selecting where you're going to put your website. Now, once we've made all these kind of decisions, the next thing we're going to want to do is actually begin designing the website. Now, designing a website is not as simple as just throwing a bunch of stuff together and putting the website live onto the internet. A lot of things can go wrong. A lot of the time when websites are created, they're created by people who don't think from the perspective of the user of the website, the human being who's going to be viewing the website. They think about it from a technical perspective, like what kind of information, what kind of technologies, make it as streamlined as possible, put as much information on as possible. But at the end of the day, the person using the website has no idea what they're doing. They don't like the way the website looks. It's not appealing. And what we in essence need to do is ensure we build the right website that looks the right way for our target audience, that provides them with the information they need to fulfill the processes that they need to go through in order to achieve the purpose of the website, which is very often going to be some kind of an e-commerce site. So I've given some links to some web pages here to go look at, which are well-designed web pages versus poorly designed web pages. So I'm going to take us to those now so we can actually have a look. Let's just hope we don't run into the same problem as we did last time, where it doesn't actually show the website. It doesn't. There we go. Are you able to actually see the web pages? Apparently, when the slideshow is live, it doesn't like to show that. Okay, cool. So here we are. I'll just restart the slideshow. So let's look at, I want to compare a few web pages with you. So if you look at a web page like this, some things you should notice. Crispness, cleanliness, the ability to kind of just look and see information at a glance. So I'm not going to draw your eye to anything in particular, and I want you to draw your own conclusions about what you think is good versus what you think is bad about this particular website. So if you look at a website like this is just the Dropbox website. If you haven't used Dropbox, it's just a place where you can store your data on the cloud, your files, and have it automatically sync and update. So, like, if I didn't know what Dropbox was, I could quickly go and look straight away here and see why Dropbox, and we can see other information about that, all sort of categorized. Here it gives me some information in quick little image format. Store, sync, share, stay secure, collaborate. We can read a little bit more in the subtext, and then more information about things can be provided, like, well, what about family, about improving productivity, and it gives you kind of like just a quick injection of information. Compare that to something like this website. This website also looks slick, it also looks clean, but when we start looking at this website, there are a couple of problems. This website has animated images, and it has a lot of animated images. This website takes a good 10-15 seconds to load, even on a fiber connection. So this website is not designed for people who are going to be using this on mobile phones using their own data. So, and also if you look at this website, what is this? Okay, so it's University of Advanced Technology, learn, experience, innovate, request info, call, apply, menu. So I open a menu, here's like some degrees, and there's a whole bunch of information dumped in here, admissions. So you've got to have a pretty good idea about what you want to do on this web page before you land on it. And once you start scrolling through, you've got more of these little flick overs with animation, which kind of cuts out the text, which is a little bit cluttered. And here's yet more information cluttered, and here's yet more information posed on the far right side of the screen here. So if you look at this web page, A, it takes a long time to load, B, it has data that is just, you have information just literally thrown at you, tons and tons of information. Let's look at another good web page. Like here's a Slack web page, and Slack, welcome to your new HQ. It gives some information about that, and it then goes through and shows us better ways to communicate, some kind of stuff, information here. I'm just looking at this from like a new person's perspective. Some kind of pictures, some kind of testimonials, choose a better way to work, try for free. It's very much an in your face, here's the information. Here's a product, features, integrations, security information, all just immediately from one menu. If we compare that to this one, I need to go through a menu to find all the other submenus. So in order to get to this, I have to sort of go through like 3 or 4 menus. And now look, I'm going to load this web page and load this web page and load this web page and load this web page. And there we go. We've now got the web page. And yes, it is loading on demand, but you'll note that this, not everything's loaded, not everything's aligned, and they've got pictures everywhere. I mean, do we really need to have pictures that animate for absolutely everything? So some people might say, yes, it looks cool, it looks flashy. Most mobile devices won't actually show any of that functionality, but it still need to load the GIFs and the animations and stuff like that. Now here, the next one is by far the worst. So this is the Yale School of Art. And I mean, I think it would probably be easier to pick out what's good on the web page than what's bad on the web page. A, I don't know where to look on this web page. B, why is there a person vacuuming up a fire as a tiled background for this website? So obviously this was chosen as just one of the absolute worst web pages I could find. And you'll note that it's still being updated. Spring 2021 at the School of Art. So people are legit using this website. I would very much want Lindsay Mancini to probably change this web page, or at least get a decent template that makes things look a little bit better. So make what you want out of this. I'm just trying to explain a point here, that there is such a thing as a good web page. There is such a thing as a bad web page. There's such a thing as a good looking web page that is not functional enough. I mean, look, I'm wanting to go back to the home page, and I have to wait and wait and wait and wait and wait and wait for, at least I had cached images now to work with. So in this case, what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at good versus bad in terms of the web pages themselves. So when we're designing the web pages, we need to be thinking from a perspective, this can't be a legit website. Well, apparently it is a legit website. But feel free to do your own research and determine whether or not you believe it's an actual real legit website. But there are plenty of cases of very old web pages that they just change out the content but never update the web page. Now, that was generally sort of a 90s web page thing when websites were new and you could just HTML by yourself and create your own web page, and every guy and his brother would create a web page and it would be horrible. So yeah, something we've got to think about. So now if we then think about the actual development of the website, so now we've actually designed the web page and hopefully it's a lot better than the latter two that we showed, but the idea is we need to then begin the actual implementation. Once we begin implementation, we hopefully have someone who's competent, who's going to then be actually typing the code, rigging up all the services that we need, getting everything deployed that we need, and then we need to test it. So testing and delivery are often considered to be far more important than the actual development, because testing will tell you where things don't work. It's all good and well that your website works 90% of the time, but the other 10% of the time could be debilitating for users of the system. They could prospectively not be able to use the website, which means you're effectively losing 10% of your prospective client base. So this is where you're going to make sure that you test, like, does it actually work on multiple different size screens? Does the functionality work? Because a lot of the time you'll load up a web page. Like very often I want to track a package using, say, locally, Fastway Couriers. Fastway Couriers, for whatever reason, does not work on Firefox when you want to track a parcel. But it works on Chrome, but not on Firefox. So for me, I have to then load up a different browser to use their web page, which means I don't like using it because I have to go and open another browser to do the thing I was wanting to do on my perfectly good first browser. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we have things like cross-browser compatibility. That would be one of the things that Fastway failed to do, but we also want to ensure that we have search engine optimization. Now, search engine optimization ensures that when your web page gets trawled by one of the various search engine providers, they get the right information about your web page so that your web page can be correctly indexed so that it becomes correctly searchable. You don't want to have nonsense tags and things that would lower you down the search engine rankings so that you don't actually get shown to people. Like, let's say your website sells loaves of bread and you have a poorly set up web page and the competition down the road has a much better web page that gets trawled more efficiently, they might show up higher in the rankings. And generally speaking, if you're on page 2 of a Google search, your website is never going to be seen. The majority of people will never go to the bottom of a search on Google and go to one of the O's and press on another O. Very often, if they don't find it in the very first page, it doesn't exist. Or as the saying goes, if you don't find what you're looking for on the first page of Google, you're searching for the wrong thing. I.e., they're saying that Google's always right and you need to refine what you are searching for. So other things are that we need to actually be able to maintain the website. So just because a website has its content updated doesn't mean it's being maintained. As we saw with that last Yale Art School webpage, they have content from 2021, but that webpage is still horrible and needs to actually be overhauled. So what we need to do is ensure that your webpage maintains its status on the internet and maintains its state to be relevant and provide the most up-to-date information as possible. So this is where we're going to talk about some web design principles. So the number one thing, and this is probably the most important slide, and no, you don't have to ever draw this diagram, but I want you to be able to explain the process that I'm now going to talk about, is that when you have a web page, you want someone to use your web page. If you are an e-commerce organization, you want someone to use your web page to do a transaction so that your company gets money. This is the big thing. And this all boils down to what is called the value proposition. The value proposition is where someone like a customer is going to decide whether or not they want your product and service enough to actually pay for it. Okay, so how many of you, just put a thumbs up in chat, would like a free loaf of bread, but you've got to go and pick it up from Cape Town. So if you would like a free loaf of bread, just type yes in chat, but you have to go and collect it in Cape Town. How about, let's change this a little bit. How would you like a brand new Ferrari sports car for free, but you have to go collect it in Cape Town? Would you do that? This is where the value proposition comes in. For you, the effort of going to Cape Town to get a loaf of bread is not worth it. But the effort to get a sports car from Cape Town for free is worth it. This is what we refer to as a value proposition. Another way of thinking about it is looking at something from its perceived value. Would you pay 100 Rand? Cape Town is still too far for the Ferrari. I'll go pick it up for you as long as I can keep the Ferrari. Okay, so if you think about it, effort is one thing that we factor into the value of something. Another thing is the price. In this case, we had a free loaf of bread versus a free sports car, but you had to put in some effort. A lot of people pay money to not have to put in effort. So would you buy a loaf of bread for 100 Rand? If you say yes, I have some other things that I might want to sell you, so we can talk after class. If you think no, there's a reason why you're thinking no. Well, A, you are allergic to bread or gluten and you don't want it. B, you know that the Pick n Pay down the road probably has a loaf of bread for between 15 and 20 Rand. So why should you pay at least 5 times the price when you can get the same thing for a much cheaper price? So effort and price are all part of a value proposition here. So would you pay 100 Rand for a loaf of bread, but the loaf of bread is made of solid gold? So now we're thinking a little bit differently. Bread for 100 Rand, no, but a solid gold loaf, which would be effectively worth thousands and thousands of rands, but still for 100 Rand. You would say yes to that one, but not yes to the original loaf of bread. And so in your head, you are weighing up the pros and the cons. You are estimating the value of the product, and you are then assigning that value based on something. Very often you're looking at 2 major things. The needs of your customer. So do you need a loaf of bread? If you are starving on a desert island and you had 100 Rand and someone was going to give you that loaf of bread, I'm pretty sure you would pay the 100 Rand to get that loaf of bread to not starve and die on that island. However, if there is someone else providing a loaf of bread to you on that desert island, this is market competition. So that's where we think about, well, Pick n Pay is selling the loaf of bread cheaper, therefore it affects how much I'm willing to pay for the item. So other things that could factor into this will be things like scarcity. If it's the last loaf of bread on planet Earth, well, then it might be worth a bit more than 100 Rand because there just aren't any others left. And this is why things like collectibles, like basketball or baseball cards that are very old are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars because there's only 1 or 2 of them left in existence in good condition, and people want to pay for that exclusivity because there just isn't any other competition. But also the customer feels that they need it for whatever personal reason. So we want to understand both the market as well as the customer's needs. Now, the needs of the customer can be broadly defined by their characteristics. So if you're wanting to sell sports cars, you're not going to be selling sports cars to teenagers because teenagers don't have jobs, therefore they don't have money. Also, you might be looking at what the social status of the person is. What kind of earning bracket are you looking at for someone to afford a sports car? You might find that only people in their 40s are able to afford big sports cars unless their parents are paying for it. So age might be a thing. Also, very often men are technically more likely to purchase sports cars than women. So you're probably looking at a male in their 40s who has a large income or is wealthy. So looking at and understanding the type of person you're trying to sell your product to will give you a better ability to actually sell it. Another thing would be, how are you going to allow them access to the website to sell the product? This could be, are you going to be targeting people who have maybe mobile devices or people who have web browsers on desktop computers, etc. This is less of a problem these days because a lot of technologies allow us to broadly define a web page that can be used across multiple different spheres. So apart from these main concerns, there are other things that are going to be considered hurdles for your customer to jump over. If someone comes to your website looking to buy a sports car or a loaf of bread, you need to make sure that they understand that your website sells sports cars or loaves of bread. You need to ensure that things look and feel good and professional, that you provide them with the right kind of information. You need to then provide them with confidence. Like, I don't know if you've been onto a web page and you see this page is secured by secure payment via these third-party payment providers. That provides confidence. Another thing is transparency. So having reviews, open-ended reviews where you can see what people honestly think of your products and services. If you just see 5-star reviews, I would begin to question things a little bit. So once they've got over the ease of use, then you jump over the confidence hurdle. Other things like having resources as well as relationship services are important. Those would be things like having extras and loyalty programs and things to bring people back. Whereas online resources would be things like providing up-to-date information. Like maybe you want to build a large complex order and you want to do some kind of a bulk deal. You could get an online quotation. A lot of online sellers allow you to do these kind of things. So think about that. It's more than the value proposition is more than just what is it the customer wants, how much does it cost. It's got a lot of other factors involved in it. So how will I ask this in the form of a question? Well, I might ask you to tell me what is the value proposition for a particular organization that is trying to sell this particular product to a particular customer. I want you to think about these factors and then try and explain it. Like, well, this customer might enjoy this product and value it for this particular purpose, but there's a competitor who is already selling it simpler, better, faster, cheaper, whatever, so they might be more inclined to use that one instead. But if you've got really good marketing, sometimes having the best website is not the winning factor. So there are a lot of factors that go into this, and there's very often going to be more than one right answer. In this course, very little is done in actual absolutes. This is the right answer versus that is the wrong answer. A lot of the time it's about how you argue it, how you think about the process, and how you explain it. And that's very often why I like to see you discuss things and talk about them and see if you can draw on information from throughout the course and your own personal information sometimes to substantiate your argument. So if you're interested, here are some other web design guidelines that you can read through in your own time. I'm not going to test you on these. These are purely just for you to see just some additional information. But something we need to talk about today is the actual integration of building towards what is considered Web 3.0. So a lot of us know what Web 2.0. Web 2.0 is where social media was absolutely everything. Social media was all about having information about the customer, the big data as it were, where you would have community involved, where you could then interact with other people, review things, provide information. Organizations could then harvest that information to better their business processes. When it comes down to considering Web 3.0, Web 3.0 is a little bit different. Web 3.0 is more about what is referred to as small or little data, knowing as much as you can about something in particular. Web 2.0 and big data was being able to derive meaning from an abundance of data about many customers to better the business process. Whereas when it comes to Web 3.0, we're looking more at what information can I get about you in particular so that I can then market to you more effectively, provide services to you more efficiently, and so forth. So the idea behind Web 3.0 is that you want to have as much information as possible about certain particular people to provide the best possible way and most efficient way of delivering products and services to them. Think about it, that a lot of the time when you go onto a web page and you see an advert, that advert's very often for something that you yourself have searched for. Like, let's say you want to go on a holiday somewhere. You start getting adverts for holiday services. That's not a coincidence. It's because your information is being relayed back to an AdSense or some kind of an ad provider via some kind of identifier through things like web beaconing, and that kind of information actually is then being harvested and used to provide targeted advertising. That's just one kind of Web 3.0 interaction that is possible. So if you want to read up a little bit more about the differences between these, what I really need you to know is just Web 2.0, social interaction, reviews, ratings, being able to make your company as transparent as possible. Web 3.0 is more about deriving meaning from data about small individuals so that you can individually tailor your products and services, or in most cases adverts, towards those people. Now, the final thing we need to talk about tonight is, well, technically not the final thing, but the penultimate thing we need to talk about tonight is some ethical and legal issues about the web. Now, in the web, there's an abundance of information. Just because it's published on the web doesn't mean you can just take it off the web and use it. So when considering websites and your creation of websites, you need to ensure that you have permission to use things that you have not created yourself or your organization has created. You can't just go and load up pictures, you can't just go and load up media. You have to obviously either pay for licensing of those things or you have to create it yourself. So you need to be aware of where data and information comes from so that you use it in a legal manner to avoid legal recourse against your organization. Now, very often, if you're going through a major publishing house, they will ensure that these kind of things are done for you. They'll do things like plagiarism checks to check to see if your content has been lifted verbatim from other web pages on the internet, or if your pictures and videos come from other sources that might require licensing, which could result in you being fined for their use. And this is where copyright actually comes into play. Copyright is a legal thing that needs to be upheld that ensures that creators are not ripped off and having their creations taken from them. Therefore, the right to copy is then reserved so that other people can't just make copies or reproductions of an original work and adapt it without paying some form of a license for it. So copyright is all about protecting or safeguarding individual creativity or organizational creativity. And sometimes these kind of processes can be good to protect original works, but they can also be used in a malicious way. So a lot of the time, if you've got video-based content and you go and create a YouTube video because you're a YouTube content creator now, all of a sudden, because of the pandemic, and you just use an excerpt of someone's video, well, that can sometimes fall into a legal gray area. Some people might claim that it's fair use because you're doing it for commentary or something along those lines. Other people might not agree, and then that's when it becomes some kind of a legal battle. So you have things like patent trolls who are going to be then reporting on your use of something, even though it isn't really infringing on copyright. It might actually then result in still you having to take it to court, which could be a costly battle. So things to bring into this discussion will be things like, how do different legislations and countries handle data? You got to think about privacy concerns about the data as well. It's like you can't just take people's data and start using it. There's controls in place that need to be adhered to ensure that the data is used correctly. So very often you got to think about copyright as this very broad and somewhat flexible legal statute that needs to be upheld. So I like to give this in the form of an example, that a cookbook is what we call an expression of ideas. So I see a question here. Out of curiosity, if I upload content to YouTube as a content creator, do I own the content or does YouTube own the content? So I actually don't know what YouTube's terms of service are. As far as I'm aware, now I might be wrong on this. And when it comes to YouTube, YouTube, you hold the copyright of the content which you produce. So you create a video, it is your creative work. Therefore, you have the rights reserved for your creative work. Now, I'm not a copyright lawyer, so don't take this as legal advice. But because you created the work, it is your creative work. You then upload it to YouTube based on their licensing terms. You would then be licensing YouTube to host the work and then display it. So obviously you want to create the work to make money off of it. So YouTube wants you to create original content so that you and YouTube don't get sued for hosting someone else's content. So you will maintain the rights to it as well as technically the liability to it. So if you get sued by a big organization, I am pretty sure that YouTube is going to step away and say, well, you created the content, therefore let the hammer of the law fall upon you and you need to handle this. And that's where copyright striking and things like that come into play when it comes to YouTube. So if you think about it, a cookbook is what we call an expression of ideas. So when it comes to a cookbook is got a bunch of recipes inside of it. So you create this pretty cookbook and you put pictures of all the meals and you put all the recipes in there. Copyright protects the cookbook. Someone can't go and make verbatim copies of your cookbook with your recipes in it. What copyright does not protect is the way in which the content of the cookbook is used. So you can go and buy the cookbook and then produce the recipes. So copyright doesn't stop you from selling baked goods that are based on the recipes out of the cookbook. Copyright protects or prevents you from making copies of the cookbook. So as I highlighted here, copyright only protects the expression of the idea, which is the cookbook. It does not protect the use of the idea, which is the actual use of the recipe. And that is where then patenting comes into play. Patenting protects, or rather prevents others from using your novel idea. So if you were to patent a way of creating food, i.e. a recipe, then if someone uses your recipe, they would be infringing on your patent and they should then be entitled to pay punitive damages and or royalties based on your process. So if you were to create a brand new way of, it has to be a brand new way of doing XYZ process, and someone goes and follows that XYZ process, they are entitled to pay you for, you've obviously got the patent for that process, they need to then be able to do that thing, but it's your process, so they must pay you money for it. So for things to be patentable, they need to be novel. You can't go and patent something that already exists and is in use. You must also patent things that are useful, i.e. a process that has some kind of a goal to do something. And it must show some form of ingenuity and therefore not be obvious. You can't patent something like walking because that is not novel. But also, walking is something that is obvious. You can't go and patent it because A, it's already in existence, B, it's not showing any form of ingenuity. But something to also note is that patents expire 20 years after the filing date. So you have 20 years of advantage based on patenting that you can then make use of for your own financial gains. After that, the patent then will lapse and will then go into public domain and be able to be used by everyone. So these kind of things are things you need to consider, is that you can't just go out and do something, create this process without doing your due diligence to see, are there any patents that already do this new novel thing? Am I infringing on copyright in creating these things? So question, does it mean that if I find the recipe of the Coca-Cola, I can make some and sell? So based on that, the recipe for Coca-Cola would boil down to the copyright thing. Like, you are creating a recipe and you can't really patent the recipe. But I do feel that when it comes down to the patentability of something, Coca-Cola, I'm pretty sure, filed patents for the process by which they create things. So they might not be able to nail you on the copyright ability of something, but if you have to follow the process to create the recipe, then I'm pretty sure that they can then get you on the patentability side of things. But also, Coke's been around for a very long time, which means that if they did have any patents on something, they probably would have lapsed by now. So, as I say, I'm not 100% sure about that, but it is a consideration or something that you can think about. Okay, so moving along, the last thing of legal considerations is that other things that you need to consider is there's a number of other things to consider. First and foremost, things like the places that you're going to be performing or operating your website, how you're going to then be taxed. So if you're running something out of one country, you might need to be taxed based on that country's laws. Other things to consider would be things like the actual laws of the land and how liability works. Okay, just as a quick question here, are you guys still able to see me? I'm just getting an error from YouTube's side saying I don't have enough data going through, but I seem to have a pretty steady connection. Okay, so please let me know if you are hearing me. Streaming software says I'm going fine. Maybe it's just YouTube being weird. Anyhow, so things to consider would be... Okay, great. Thank you very much. Good to know. It's just YouTube being weird with some weird messages on my side. So other things to know, which we're not going to dive into in any kind of real depth, would be things like, say, privacy, GDPR, versus things like protection of personal information. In South Africa, like, the way in which you handle people's data is going to affect the way that you're going to build your website and manage the data of the people using your website. Because if you don't manage people's privacy correctly, well, then you might not be able to operate your website in Europe. If you don't adhere to POPI, you won't be able to then operate your website in South Africa. So these kind of considerations, especially from the legal side of things as well as the logistical side of things, is going to affect how you build your website at the end of the day. So the final matter of importance here is that everything that we've talked about tonight is going to ultimately affect how you create the website, what kind of content it's going to have, and how you manage the data and transactions that are going to be done on said website. So I know we just talked in a very, very cursory manner about the content of a website, what the important things were, some basic things about legal and ethical things, like in terms of, like, say, ethical things, like you don't really, if you're infringing upon the law of the land, then it's not probably ethical to do that, but also you don't want to be doing things in the background that are unethical. So I'm going to leave that up to your ethics lecturer to teach you about ethics, and you can then consider this set of slides from a different perspective based on that. So based on tonight's content, that's all I really have for you. The most important things I want you to think about is really that a web page is going to be a delivery mechanism. It's going to deliver information to the people who are going to be arriving on the web page. You need to do that as efficiently as possible. You need to build a good, solid web page to do that. You need to maintain it. You need to make sure you're not breaking any laws while doing it. And ultimately, you need to provide value in what you're doing. So I think, if anything, the value proposition is the most important discussion of tonight's lecture. And that's all I've got for you. Are there any questions? Remember, as per usual, if you have questions, you're welcome to ask them here. You're welcome to ask them in the Discord server. And for those of you who do not have any questions, please enjoy the rest of your evening. And I will see you again next week for some more content. Okay, thank you everyone. I'm not seeing any questions coming through, so if you do have any questions, please ask them on the Discord server. Have a wonderful evening. I will see you all next week. Enjoy.